So this afternoon I plan to talk to you for about 15 minutes or so and discuss a case study using the United States and the United States defense engagement with Africa. So I want to talk a little bit about how did the U.S. defense relationships in Africa get to where they are today. I mean, if you think about it, the U.S. really doesn't have colonial ties like the British and the French and the Portuguese. I mean, one could argue maybe Liberia to some extent, but really we don't have that long historical relationship. And then during the Cold War, it was really just a matter of side choosing, really. There was this bipolar world where countries either aligned with the Soviet Union, China, and the Eastern Bloc, or they aligned with the U.S. and the capitalist grouping, if you will. But then the Cold War ended. And you could argue at this point that there's a blank slate, and it really made a change in how the U.S. would approach Africa and their defense relationships. So there was a recognition that this created an opportunity. And the policymakers at the time, they did the right thing. They recognized that there's a changing environment, and a changing environment requires a reassessment of the strategy. So you see the two quotes that we have up here. They said, okay, this is our chance to reset and look beyond the Cold War of where we're going with Africa. So the National Security Review, number 30, which was titled American Policy Towards Africa in the 90s, was issued in June of 1992. And it was really quite prescient. Within that document, it tasked the policymakers to take a new look at Africa. And it directed the formulation of policy options to address countering violence and instability, reducing terrorist activities, and mitigating environmental degradation. And you see this quote on here. They asked the question, does Islamic extremism present a threat to the U.S. interest in Africa? Now remember, this was in 1992. So they did this review, this new look at Africa, and what do you think they came up with? They came up with National Security Directive 75, which came out of National Security Review 30. And what they decided was that the U.S. had no vital interest in Africa. So they did this assessment. It was post-Cold War. And what the document said was the reduced strategic importance of Africa to the United States and the post-Cold War world should be reflected by redirecting some U.S. military resources into peacekeeping and humanitarian relief. And they also said there's no requirement to station troops or construct bases in Africa. U.S. forces should occasionally train there, but just to get experience of working in the Africa region. So they decided there's no vital interest. The interests really are assisting with PKO and humanitarian relief, and no troops are required. So this ushered in an era of minimal engagement, if you will. How many people in the audience are graduates of the U.S. IMET program? How many have trained here in the U.S. under IMET? Anyone? We have 1, 2, 3. Okay, interesting. During this period of minimal engagement, there were really two main forms of defense cooperation between the U.S. and Africa at that time. And first and foremost was the IMET program. The IMET program was a program that allowed African military officers to come to the United States and go to professional military education courses. And it wasn't unit training, it was usually individuals. You would take an individual and bring him back and go to a platoon commander's course or go to a company commander's course. You know, individuals coming back for courses. The other tool during that time was the Joint Combined Exchange Training. And that was where small teams of U.S. Special Forces soldiers would come in and do training events with their counterparts in African militaries. But it's important to understand that those events were designed to enhance the capability of the U.S. Special Forces soldiers. It was to give them that experience of working in Africa. So true, there was some residual benefit to the African troops that trained with them, and certainly the U.S. military personnel got benefit of working with their African partners. But really, it was very inward-looking. It was to try to increase the capability of the U.S. Special Forces and get that experience working with Africa. So it was very, very minimal engagement during this time, during the in the immediate post-Cold War period. And then there was a change. And what precipitated the change was an analysis after the genocide in Rwanda. So after the genocide happened in Rwanda, there was a lot of soul-searching throughout the international community, but particularly within U.S. engagement with Africa. And they said, okay, what can we do different? And what happened was it wasn't a fundamental change in the strategy per se, but it was a more of a focus on what you saw on that previous slide of, where are we at here? No, on this one here, of the peacekeeping side of the house. So there was a phrase that was adopted both among African nations and within the OAU at that time and among international partners which said we want to have African solutions to African problems, and that's the way to get at this. So on the U.S. side of the house, they created a program called the Africa Crisis Response Initiative, ACRI, A-C-R-I. Is anyone here familiar with the ACRI program? Again, several. For a long time, it was the foundational military-to-military engagement program that the United States had with African countries in that period after the Cold War and into the, starting in 1999. So they developed the Africa Crisis Response Initiative, and it was designed to create peacekeepers, so that African militaries can contribute to peacekeeping operations. And that was a result in the post-Rwanda period. So from 1992 to 2001, really the U.S. military relationships with most African countries can be defined as minimal engagement and minimal resource commitment. So then what changed next? It changed in 2001. 9/11, the attacks on the United States soil, really was a wake-up call to many within the government on national security strategy, in particular how it related to Africa. You could argue that the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in August of 1998 may have been a precursor to it, and perhaps maybe there was something missed in the strategy. And it was linked to al-Qaeda, those bombings were, yes, but I think the understanding at the time was it wasn't really about a terrorist threat and terrorism and violent extremists growing within Africa. Those were merely soft targets that al-Qaeda took as an opportunity within Africa. But then 9/11 changed that. It was attacks on the home soil, and it was a wake-up call about really what was the threat to terrorism, how did it impact national security strategy. So how did that translate to Africa? If you remember, in 1992, there was a group called the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, which goes by in the acronym in English, GSPC. And so they were initially operating out of Algeria, and then through that area in the southern part of Algeria. So in reaction, the U.S. created a program called the Pan-Sahel Initiative. So this was in November of '02. And you can see the quote below from Zawahiri. This was actually, the quote was made in 2007. But for the long time, the GSPC aligned themselves as an al-Qaeda affiliate. So now you saw al-Qaeda organizations growing and operating on the African continent. In 2002, there was the formation of the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, which exists to this day in Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti. Now remember back to the previous quote, when they did the National Security Directive, they said there was no need to put troops or create bases in Africa. But now there's obviously a fundamental change in how they approach the security situation in Africa. And then lastly, you see that in 2003, President Bush at the time announced over $100 million over 15 months to help countries in the region to increase counterterror efforts. So all these significant changes within 1 year's time after the attack on 9/11. It's interesting if you look at that last amount there, the $100 million over the next 15 months. I mentioned that from 1992 in the post-Cold War era that the two predominant programs were IMET and JSETS. Well, this $100 million is almost twice as much as what the entire IMET budget was for all African countries in the preceding 10 years to this point. And then the last thing that happened was the emergence of AFRICOM, which came along formally in 2007. In pre-2007, there was 3 geographic combatant commands that shared responsibility for implementing defense strategy in Africa. It was the European Command, Central Command covered the part of Kenya and the Horn of Africa, and Pacific Command actually covered the island nations down along the coast with Madagascar, Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros in that area. And it's interesting, as I worked in Africa in the late 90s and early 2000s, I'd frequently get the question from my colleagues and counterparts in African militaries is, why do you not have an Africa command? It's almost insulting that you have European command responsible for implementing your U.S. defense strategy within Africa. And the irony of that is then after we stood up the U.S. Africa Command, everywhere you went you got the question, why do you have an Africa Command? Are you trying to take over Africa? Are you trying to militarize your foreign policy? So you can't win no matter how you have it. So, but pre-2007, it was split. The implementation was split among 3 geographic combatant commands. So why was Africa Command, AFRICOM, created? And really, it was to manage and implement this burgeoning resources and programs that were a result of the greater interest and the fundamental change linked to post 9/11 and the threat of terrorism to the U.S. There were now vital U.S. national interests in Africa, where if you remember in the National Security Directive, they decided no vital interest in Africa. When there's no vital interest, programs and resources are small. Now they decide there's definitely vital interest related to our relationship with Africa. So as a result, Africa Command was created. It was created purely for efficiency reasons. It was to leverage the joint capabilities from the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, all the elements of the Defense Force, all the interagency activities that happened. The operations, the engagement, and the relationships all now were implemented through U.S. Africa Command, one geographic combatant command. So for 14 years, if you look from 2001, actually 15 years to 2016, there's this growing importance of counterterrorism and this transition from what was originally peacekeeping operations to peace support operations. I mentioned the Africa Crisis Response Initiative program earlier. In 2002, that also transitioned to what was called the African Contingency Operations Training and Assistance, or ACOTA. Is anyone here familiar with the ACOTA program? So the ACOTA program was a transition from the Africa Crisis Response Initiative. The Pan-Sahel Initiative, which you saw that started in 2002, transitioned into the Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, which still exists to this day. So you have ACOTA, which still operates to this day, which focuses on peace support operations. You have the TSTCP program, Trans-Sahel, which focuses to this day. And then the U.S. introduced their Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, which is $5 billion US dollars focused on counterterrorism strategy. So what are the takeaways from this change in how the U.S. defense engagement related to Africa? First and foremost is changing conditions requires an assessment to see if a change in the strategy is required. However, as you probably heard this morning, a sound strategy should look to the future and anticipate trends. So if you find that there are frequent changes in your strategy, that perhaps you have a faulty strategy. So really it's about fundamental change, change that is not necessarily anticipated, that requires the change in a national security strategy. So let me give just a brief critique here of this U.S. case study. And you ask, could these future conditions have been anticipated? And if you look at the National Security Review 30, which was published back in 1992, where they asked the question, do these terrorist threats emanating from Africa matter? You could argue, well, maybe they could have anticipated this trend and developed a national security strategy that didn't require fundamental changes. And if they had committed more resources earlier, maybe they could have avoided some of these conditions later on. But that's, I don't know, 9/11 was really a fundamental change. It would have been hard to predict that type of attack on the U.S. soil to predicate the change. So the second point is, was there really a sound strategic response, a sound strategic change based on what happened with 9/11 and the defense engagement relationship and the military strategy with Africa? And if you look at it in terms of ends, ways, and means, definitely the ways and means changed. If you look at the programs that were put in place and the amount of resources that were put against it, the ways and means changed. But did the ends really change? Were there strategic ends that were clearly defined, and then there was a marshaling and a coalescence of the resources and the ways available to effect those changes? And think again what I said about the Pan-Sahel Initiative, which became the Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Program, or the CTPF, which exists now. You think about ACRI, which started in 1999 and persists to ACOTA today. There's an argument by some that institutions take a generation to build. Well, if you take 16 years of a program or 17 years of a program, you could argue that you're almost there for a generation. So the national security strategy should really create effects over time. And there's an anecdote when the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund was first proposed and they laid out all this money to go to Africa. Members of Congress, which if you look across you see the dome of Congress right through that window there, they said, okay, you can do all these train and equip programs to build this operational capability on a Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, but you need to strengthen and build defense institutions. You need defense institution building. And the irony of that is, if you look back at what the ACOTA program started out to do, they said they wanted to change from creating capability to capacity, and they wanted to strengthen institutions. If you look at the Pan-Sahel Initiative and TSTCP, they wanted to strengthen the institutions. So over time, there's always been this goal of strengthening and building institutions. But I would argue, with the institutions, the defense institutions, that would need strengthening for, say, the ACOTA program for peace support operations, would they not be the same defense institutions that would also assist with counterterrorism programs? But yet, from the program side of the house, they were looked at a little bit differently, rather than maybe perhaps holistically within what ends are they trying to create within the strategy. So the point I'll leave you with is, when a radical change happens, and you have to assess your national security strategy and make changes to the strategy, you have to go back to what are the ends you're trying to achieve, what are the objectives in the end states, and then realign the ways and means to that. If you realign just the ways and means without the proper attention on the ends, you're not really changing your strategy. You're reacting to change. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.